Let's get started. I'll try to be patient. First time I ever got taped professionally was at Harvard. They came and they taped me teaching a subsection on Joe Nye's famous core course on international conflict or something like that. This legendary course. And I watched the video afterwards of me teaching a section of about, 15 kids. And the big complaint I got from the teachers who were evaluating me was that I didn't show enough patience to force people to ask questions. Mark Evans asks, what do we know about nation building? Well, we began as 13 colonies and now we're 50 states and about 570, I think, sovereign Native American nations and 9 territories. So we know something about putting together a package, I would say. I think if you're going to really do nation building, you got to go and you got to stay and become partners. We never left Germany. We never left Japan. Those are our 2 big successes, and they are world-shaping successes. But the kind of thing where you just go in and hope to connect stuff up before you can leave, that doesn't work. Right now, as I argue, in the stack, I think we're in a implicit relationship with the Chinese, where basically every time we go somewhere, it's the Chinese who end up connecting and taking advantage. And I don't think that's a problem because they're the natural integrator of the age. It just comes off as a problem for this current political climate. And I'm going to repeat the question David asked earlier about, do you think this may be the last chance for China to take Taiwan, like Russia to take Ukraine? And I'm interpreting that as a generational question. And my answer is yeah. I think once you get like a 3rd generation past the original gripe point, or where they can't remember what the fight was about or what the ideological connection was, then I think it does lose its steam. So, Xi Jinping's probably the last generation that grew up in the shadow of the whole Taiwan Straits and the crises of the 1950s and into the 60s and all that. And once they pass, I think they probably do wonder and worry that there won't be any impetus among the populace to connect Taiwan. So I think there is a certain generational fuse there. And I think, honestly, that's what I think drives Putin. So I think it's a good point on both examples cited. I think these things are settled or forgotten within a generation or so because they're getting pretty long in the tooth. Nicole asks, can you speak to the situation in Cuba? Would Cuba even want to be part of the U.S.? There is a generational gap there between the old-timey believers who would rather die than join the United States and the younger generations who I think would be happy to have unfettered access to the United States and special status, whether that's a citizen thing or just a free visa thing or, whatever that would allow them to connect. And once you establish those kind of people-to-people connections and allow for the Miami Cuban community to start investing heavily in Cuba, once you open that up, I think sentiment will change pretty damn rapidly. And I think it's a very solid case for Cuba to be join the United States within the next generation. it is kind of interesting right now the way we're abusing them and then offering them aid at the same time. It's sort of like a hostage situation or a torture situation. We're really putting them through the grinder, and then yet we're letting in a little bit of humanitarian this and a little bit of humanitarian that. I really hope that doesn't go on for very long, because um, it doesn't typically go well if you drag it out. But yeah, Cuba's a place, per Mark Evans, Cuba's a place where we would stay. And, and we would stay because we'd let them in effect. And, what a tremendous signal to the rest of the hemisphere it would be to have those talks broached and that idea propagated, and for young people in Cuba to be thinking about that possibility. Richard Taro asks, please say more about China's role as much needed, all important system administrator. Well, it's like that post I put up about the grand bargain that I proposed back in 2010 with that couple from Beijing and their Center for American-U.S. or China-U.S. partnership. It's totally natural for a saver who's done very well and moved up the ladder and joined globalization and is now going into high-end manufacturing and technology and whatnot. It's perfectly appropriate for that country with all that accumulated wealth, through largely mercantilist means. It's perfectly fine and natural for that country to start investing backwards or kind of up the chain to more mature economies, because they want their money to go places they feel safe. So, we got the Dutch to invest in us right after our revolution. We got the Brits to invest in us across the 19th century. They're still the two biggest investors in the United States. We got the Germans to invest in us, and we got the Japanese to invest in us, our two World War II opponents. So can we get a natural investment flow from the Chinese to the United States? Yeah, that makes perfect sense. If we can get past this sense of competition, or at least get some sort of open understanding about what's acceptable behavior as we both, seek to wire up the world to our advantage, sort of a rules of the road, because we're going to be the two big offerers in terms of network connectivity. Then I think China stepping up and playing that kind of sysadmin role and leaving the Leviathan policing, such as it remains, largely to us. I think that is the G2. And that's how it works out. Richard Taro is following up. What he said before was, I don't know, Persian Gulf, for instance. By the way, sounds good here. Okay. With the rain. Yeah. Okay. I really think when we talk the Persian Gulf, that is definitely where China's going to be the big player, and the Indians. And I think that the tragedy of what's going on right now with Iran vis-a-vis UAE and Qatar and the Saudis is that they're going to go and dip into those massive multi-trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds, and the money that should have been going to foreign direct investment across Africa and other places is now going to be cannibalized to maintain standard of living and to keep a migrant working population, in the case of Qatar, from fleeing the country, which would be very destabilizing, because 90% of their labor is expats from around the world, but largely from South and Southeast Asia. So, yeah, the sooner we get the thing with Iran settled, the better and the faster those kinds of funds can be used for increasing connectivity between the Middle East and the outside world. This is such a huge setback, and I don't think they thought this through at all in the White House. Mark Evans says, I'm concerned that all our Miami Cubans want to go there and get their land back. There is some of that. And you'd probably have to figure out some sort of commission to figure some of that out. But that can be massaged and that can be worked, and that whole process, if done well, can be kind of wonderfully healing. But it's not easy. I mean, they've tried to do that in South Africa, and it's difficult. But the process itself is of value, and it's part of how they grow in the situation and in the role. How bad, says Richard Toro, how bad was the Doge USAID cutoff? I think historically, they're going to tag us for 5 to 10 to 15 million deaths around the world. I swear to God, it's going to be like a Holocaust level total. And you'll say, well, they would have died anyway, or it's not our responsibility. But we started things, we made commitments, we created certain levels of dependency. We made the effort to look out for our fellow man and whatnot. And then we just whacked it all off one afternoon. And what's sad about the USAID cutoff, they've got this new kind of finance corporation that's going to substitute for it. But, we're such a huge player in the global economy. For us to be reduced to that kind of mercantilist investment, almost kind of aping the Chinese instead of being who we are, the loss of soft power on that one's going to be huge. And the real tragedy, like a lot of the things associated with Doge, is that there's no putting the Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once you fire all these people, a lot of them just check out for good in terms of retire. A lot of them leave the area, and you've scared off an entire generation of people that might have been interested in working for the government. So it's going to be a kind of a massively crippling thing in terms of personnel and expertise in our country, in terms of running things on a federal and international level. I don't think they've thought that through at all either, but I don't think they care. I think they just wanted to smash, and do as much damage before the courts caught up with them. And that's the situation we're in. Beyond anything Andrew Jackson ever did, if you're going to use that historical example. David Blair asks, will the U.S. see Chinese companies build plants here like Japan in the 80s and 90s to beat tariffs? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's that whole China-USA partnership thing. That's what that was all about. It's ultimately to get them to go down the path the Japanese did. When I was a kid, rice burners, motorcycles, little bitty cars from Japan, people would key them because they hated them, make fun of them. They'd vandalize them, sort of like what people did with Teslas not that long ago. And how did they get past that? Well, they became American made by coming here and building factories and creating constituencies of job holding workers. And that's how you do it. And, it's going to be tough to keep the Chinese out. I think I noted, based on an excerpt from the book recently, but I mean, we used to be a big chunk of global car production, and now we're really, out of all the cars being built around the world, we're a pretty small fraction, even though we're a big market. So yeah, I mean, one of the best ways to kind of break barriers and create comity between us and the Chinese would be to allow Chinese investment. And it should be in manufacturing. It should not be in farming, because that's too testy a subject. And it won't work. And it's a little too risky. But on the manufacturing side, yeah, absolutely. They should come here and make themselves as, regular and American and apple pie as Honda and Toyota are now. I mean, there's not much of a perception that they're a foreign company like there was when I was a kid. And you still had people who had fought the Japanese, for example. So yeah, that's going to be a big sign when we get to that level of maturity. And I really had hopes Trump was going to pull something off. He's always bragging about being able to create $1 trillion investment flows. I mean, that's the country we should be getting it from. Richard Taro, for years we've been hearing that Saudis want to be Saudi Arabia of solar. Yeah, for real this time, implications. Yeah, I think they want to be that. Um, I think they want to. They they burn a lot of their own energy that they would rather export. So they're very interested in nuke and solar and anything like that because they're trying to cut down their own consumption, which has really skyrocketed in the last 20, 30 years, by my understanding. So they want to preserve as much of their oil reserves for export. So there's smart, logical reason for them to do that. I think what's much more interesting right now is the desire to become like data centers and AI players, and they are kind of in the middle of air routes throughout the whole Eastern Hemisphere, and they've been very successful at becoming several of the largest airlines in the world. I think if I were them, I'd be interested in that whole AI play. I'd be interested in kind of extending that southward into sub-Saharan Africa. I'd be looking at 1 out of 4 humans mid-century being African and half of them being under 18, and that being the center of consumption. And I'd want to be, as much as possible, in charge of building and maintaining those networks. And if that meant getting in bed with the Chinese in a big way, or the Indians, I think that would be a very powerful integrating force. And I think it's something we should encourage. And it's interesting, we may burn out a whole bunch of goodwill and kind of unleash the Frankenstein that Israel's becoming in terms of expansionism. And we may be out of the Middle East in a big and bad way as a result of this whole Iran thing, depending on how bad it goes. Nicole, when all is said and done and the orange clown is gone, what do you think the reputational damage will be for the U.S.? It's going to be a while before people trust us again, like 2 or 3 administrations, and they're going to have to be on both sides. And it's going to be hard. Our reputational damage, mostly self-inflicted, is countered by the fact that people still love us and our culture, and that everybody almost everywhere has, like, if they have a second culture, the second culture's American in addition to their own. So we've got a lot of goodwill, but yeah, we've spent it tremendously. And the fact that Trump came back after a 4-year absence was particularly disheartening for people who are concerned about that shift in our interaction with the outside world. And then for this second go around with Trump to be so weirdly interventionist and menacing, in the national security realm, beyond all the tariff and the trade stuff, and the ask for $1.5 trillion defense is just, I find that so bizarre. I don't know, if Congress goes along with that, that's just sort of the end of Congress on that point, because I just think it's insanity for us to be bulking up at that level, especially when they're going to buy a whole bunch of old platforms that aren't going to be worth anything, 10, 15 years down the road as warfare changes. So I think it's a long recovery for us, unfortunately, generational. David Blair, is there any interest in making a channel-like connection between Alaska and Russia for trade? That's interesting. That would have to probably await a post-Putin thing. And I've said it here before. I really see Russia kind of coming apart. I see the Trans-Ural, I see the Far East, and I see the European part. And I could see the Chinese being interested in a tunnel like that, financing it and making that sort of connectivity. I think if it's just between us and the Russians on a bilateral basis, I don't think there's enough there to make it happen. But I could see the Chinese pushing for it as they come to run Russia's Far East more and more over time. Okay, I'm all caught up on questions. People got to ask. Alan, you've pointed out India's many qualities which point it in the direction of being a great power, but I see much of the country in your Middle Earth climate danger zone. How do you see that playing out? Do you see them getting ready, or are they sleepwalking? That is possibly the biggest question of the century, on some levels. And I've been saying this, I think, for like 2 or 3 books now. That, if you think of globalization as sort of like 2 big Western hubs, Europe and the United States, lean, hard, democratic. And then you have 2 big hubs in the East, the Russians and the Chinese. Then, the rubber match is sort of India. And India is democratic, but it also has a lot of the same tendencies of other Asian countries towards authoritarianism. And it's a raucous place and a very vigorous political process over there. It's true. Most of their country is located below the 30th parallel north. And it's something like 45% of their population is still in agriculture. So if I'm looking at India, which grows tremendous amounts of food and consumes almost all of it, they have no exports. They're very self-sufficient, but they're just barely getting there. And they're still going up in terms of population size. You need to see a mechanization and a modernization of their agriculture simultaneous to or with an explosion in manufacturing and other service jobs to absorb that labor that gets pushed off the land. And if it doesn't happen, those 2 things, and that's a hell of a trick. I mean, we pulled it off in about 60, 70 years in the United States. They're going to have to pull it off much faster. But, they are high tech. And drones and everything else. I mean, I think we're, as a rule, underestimating how important that kind of big data and the censoring of nature, censoring with an S, and drones and robots and all that kind of stuff are going to do for agriculture under, tougher conditions as imposed by climate change. And I see India being a huge laboratory for that. And I see, a future of just hundreds of thousands, millions of drones kind of operating and taking care of plants on a very intimate basis. And that's how we maintain yields and production, despite it being that much harder. And that's going to include like a massive correction of the way that we manage water in our system. And we're starting to realize that now more and more. So are they getting ready? Yeah. Is their task unbelievably hard? Yeah. Should we be on their side? Absolutely. Because again, then it sort of makes it 3 against 2 if you're thinking democracies versus autocracies in terms of the 5 big powers kind of running the system this century. So I spend a lot of time watching and cheering for India as much as possible. And the trick there is that the country that needs to kind of set them up the most are the Chinese, which means they have to kind of figure out how to get along in a different and positive way. And, it's sort of like Germany and France finally getting along, after Napoleonic and World War I and World War II and Franco-Prussian War and all that kind of stuff. There's not the same conflict history there. And yet there's a lot of tension on the border, and I'm hoping it's going to play itself out. I think it's a little bit stuck right now with Xi being the only leadership that China gets to have forever, apparently. So, but it's huge. Nicole asked, what's the current status of Russia? How's the economy there dealing with the war situation? Is the war draining it? Internal pressure to leave Ukraine? All those things, are legit questions. All of them seem to be trending negatively for Putin and positively, for the outside world. He has cannibalized large parts of the economy, spent down his sovereign wealth fund, conned the North Koreans to sending fresh meat. They do all sorts of tricky conscription scams around the world to get bodies, to throw them against the Ukrainians. I mean, it's really bad and getting worse. But we're kind of stuck with this situation where you really need the oligarchs inside Russia to come to the conclusion that they're better off post-Putin, whatever that takes. And that's really hard to tell from the outside. But he's starting to tap them for money to pay for the war, and that's a really bad sign. So I give it about 50-50 odds. The Russians going to have to close this off in the next 2 to 3 years. It's really hard to imagine it keep going and Putin maintaining authority and stature on that basis. He also looks not good. So I think there's a decent chance he dies in the next 2-3 years. David Blair, you mentioned the jihadi threat moving more to Africa after the second in command for ISIS being killed there. Does this confirm that militant Islam? Yeah, it does. I mean, if you look at the terrorist activities as compiled on a global basis, the center of gravity is the Trans-Sahel now. So absolutely. And it's a fertile place for them. It's barely governed. You got the cowboy versus the farmer that breaks along religious lines, along the so-called 10th parallel. Muslims, nomadic to the north, herders, Christians, pastoralists, farmers to the south. And it's the old Rodgers and Hammerstein thing. The cowboy and the farmer can't be friends. And, with desertification sort of squeezing downward from climate change as the Saharan desert expands over time, you got pressure. So that's, I would love to be working that problem, in concert with the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians, because I think we could relieve such an immense amount of suffering and whatnot. But we still have, such a sense of competition and, threat profile with the Chinese that prevents a lot of things that we could do positively around the planet if we could get past it. That's why it kind of drives me nuts where everybody acts like Taiwan is the key to the future of the planet or something. I don't see it any more than I ever thought a two-state solution was the key to the future of peace in the Middle East. Richard Taro, don't hear much talk about what the people of eastern Ukraine, land annexed by Russia, think about their sovereignty. No calls for fair elections and such. Yeah, I see very, very little independent reporting on the situation in eastern Ukraine other than it's pretty dire in a material sense, and people are really unhappy, as you can imagine, because they're all within flying distance of the front line. And I got to imagine it's just been exhausting and totally demoralizing. And I got to believe they would really want some sort of settlement, whatever it was. But it's hard to imagine that so long as Putin's in power. So it's like either the oligarchs get rid of him, somebody puts a bullet in his head, or his health finally catches up to him. And who knows? I got 840. Any more questions? David Blair, is Russia just too big? And with demographic shrinking, will China or even North Korea start taking Siberia? I think everybody's going to start taking Russia over time. I really do. As a student of Russian history, I was a Russian major at Wisconsin back in the 80s. The whole story of why they created the Tsar and made him all powerful. And everybody's afraid of the Tsar, and the Tsar has magical powers, and the Tsar descends directly from God and that kind of stuff. And, as the leader of the church and everything else. The reason why they built up the Tsar so much throughout their history is that they just wanted to create this facade or this impression of great power spread across this huge landmass, when the truth has always been they can barely control it. They don't have the manpower for it. They never have. They've always had to make peace with kind of border tribes. And historically, they've co-opted tribes, most famously the Cossacks, to be, kind of like enforcers throughout the empire. The Soviet kept it together, the Soviet system, beyond what probably would have happened. I think the whole Russian Empire would have fallen apart across the 20th century otherwise. But I think it's just delayed. And I think, they made their bid to be kind of a global empire with, countries of socialist orientation that they took in under their wing in the 70s and 80s as decolonization unfolded across the Middle East and Africa and whatnot. And they've been in retreat really since the early 80s. They kind of realized that was the high water mark, that they weren't going to create any more revolutions anywhere. They kept going further back in time developmentally, trying to catch countries earlier and earlier and earlier to make them work as socialists. And it just got to be a huge sinkhole that Gorbachev cut off. And then, he pursued perestroika, and that got out of control and the whole thing fell apart. I feel like we're 40, 50 years into this collapse of the Russian system, going back to its high water mark with their third world adventurism in the early 1980s. This is my PhD dissertation. So a lot of passion here. And I think I think history is going to record the collapse of the Russian Empire as kind of unfolding from like 1980 to 2050 or something like that. And it's going to be looked back upon historically like we look at the fall of the Roman Empire, over decades. So yeah, I think it's a big carcass. I think there's too much value there. There's too much land there. There's too much arable land there. There's too many resources there. It's going to warm up very dramatically. And I really think it gets dismembered. I don't think it makes sense for the package that's tried to rule there to continue to try to rule there in an authoritarian fashion. I just see, I see at least 3 big regions that I would imagine want to go on their own and make their own deals with the outside world. And I think with this last gasp, as I would imagine it to be, of kind of Sovietism resurgence with the KGB leftovers from the Cold War, like Putin, I don't see the next generation carrying that torch, and I see the place coming apart. And there's going to be like a Slavic community, like there's a European community, and there'll be big sub-regions within it, and they'll go their own way over time. Nicole, would you speak to the siting of data centers in the U.S. and their impact on water in areas in which they are built? Yeah. Tremendous interest of mine on the basis of some consulting I've done with water companies and energy companies. The first batches of data centers, highly reliant on massive amounts of electricity and massive amounts of water. And everybody's taken that projection and said, this is what it's going to cost. If we do it, if everybody gets to ask, Chat GPT every morning what cereal they have for breakfast. It's going to take all the water and all the power in the world. And that would be true if we allowed it to be true. But it sort of reminds me of Amory Lovins and the Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory Lovins 20 years ago pointed out to me that only about 3% of the gasoline that's burned in a car actually makes the car go forward. And the rest of it is just sort of running the car. So obviously huge opportunity there for efficiency. So I can remember when I was a visiting strategist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 2000s, they took me into their supercomputer. And I mean, they showed me underneath the floor panels, these gigantic pipes, big enough to kind of like crawl through or walk through, massive amounts of water coming through there to keep that place cold. And, the same reason why they built the secret city that was Oak Ridge to enrich all that uranium back then was because it had this huge confluence of water and electricity, otherwise known as the Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's kind of obvious those kinds of experiences, if you extrapolate them, everything goes off the charts. We need like 15 Earths so that we could all, ego surf with or ego converse with our favorite avatar or whatever. It would just be completely unsustainable. So we're just beginning to see the development of closed loop systems and alternative ways that like radically, like 75%, 80% cut down the water use. And you're going to see similar things happen in the electricity situation. And to the extent it doesn't happen, more and more IT companies are going to get into the energy business and do their own energy production, like, Microsoft buying 3 Mile Island or other places kind of building their own off-grid electrical systems, which is very, late 1800s American frontier sort of redux. But I really think we're going to see just tremendous advances along those lines that, the original versions of these data centers treated water and electricity like it was infinite. And now that they've really seen what it's possible to do with that technology and how it's going to sweep the planet, there's going to just have to be a radical rethink. But that's going to be true on a lot of different consumption patterns. So, I mean, to me, this is the fascinating part of this point of the century and this point in history in my life, is that the optimization requirement is going to skyrocket. And it's just so amazing that right when we need unbelievable optimization and unbelievable kind of human evolution in response to climate change, that we get, AGI and ASI, superintelligence, and beyond that, quantum computing, all happening probably within the next 10 to 15 years. It just seems like a miracle that we've come up with all these modes of answering these unbelievably difficult questions. But to me, everything is optimization going forward and figuring out how to do better with less, not to live less, but, think about progress. Almost all of it in our experience is improvement in material sciences, and that's what they do at Oak Ridge is they improve materials, nanotechnologies and all that kind of stuff. And that's really what's going to mitigate this clash that otherwise would just be off the charts between humans and silicon as to who gets the electricity and who gets the water, which to me is a very Matrix kind of thing. And I like going back and watch those movies on that basis. Okay, I got 950. We'll go a little bit more. Richard Taro, what can Chi-Coms learn from Halliburton as far as system administration goes? Somewhat joking. When I was doing my bit as a kind of a journalist for about a decade with Esquire, I did 2 embeds with the U.S. military. And the one that was really illuminating for me was this forward operating base, FOB, down near Lamu, off the coast of Kenya. And, that base was in the middle of nowhere in the jungle. And, the kind of the servicing of the base was all Halliburton. And, they were kind of spectacular. They had really good food. It was set, the kind of memory from Vietnam where you'd like import American culture and create this little zone of American culture right there. I mean, it was still a place where if you went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you could run into a really big monkey on your path, which happened to me once, scared the crap out of me. But that's who you're going to get to do those kinds of things. And everybody thinks it's so nefarious that a Halliburton comes from the oil and gas sector. But if you think about what it takes to go to remote places and kind of create that local infrastructure and make it work for the workers there, you take that model from the oil and gas industry and it applies perfectly to the military. So what some people see as nefarious and oligarchic and gangster capitalism and whatnot, it's just kind of the natural migration of a skill set from one domain to an adjacent one. And, I'm sure Halliburton can learn a lot from the Chinese. That was the point I was making about AI and the difference between China and the US on AI is that we're perfectionists and they're not. They just want to get it across the line and make it work and get it out there and figure out other stuff after that. Halliburton companies that do that kind of stuff, you drop them in the jungle, you drop them anywhere and you just tell them you got to have this thing done. It is very, very much like working with the military, who specialize in impossible tasks under dire circumstances. That's like what they do. That may seem like a distant thing from the rest of American culture, but it's really a big part of our history. And I would say Halliburton and the Chinese probably have more in common than we might imagine and would have a much easier time working together if they were the lead as opposed to, maybe our diplomats and our military types and our hawks and whatnot. Nicole, last question. Can we have your take on the declining birth rates in the U.S. and the world? Yeah. As I like to point out, it's fascinating to me, having grown up in the 60s as a kid and being constantly scared, witless by these educational films in Catholic grade school, where it was like people were going to be like locusts and we were just going to eat each other. And Soylent Green comes out in like 1969 and it predicts an America in the year 2022 where we're just going to be eating ourselves and it's a classic example of those kinds of projections and then saying, this is how we grow food. This is how we turn it into nutrition. If we take that model and extend it and there's 20 billion people in the world, there's no way we're going to manage that. And then I think back to as being a kid running through cornfields. And then I realize, today I dare anybody to try to run through a cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so much bigger and so much stronger and so much closer together. We grow, twice as much, 2-3 times as much corn now on the same acreage or less. So those kinds of projections kind of got us all so worried about having so many kids. But everywhere you saw modernity kick in, and people go from rural to urban, you didn't have 8 kids because you didn't lose 3 of them and you don't need 5 of them to run the farm. And so once you urbanize and once you move into manufacturing and or beyond that service and technology, the desire to have kids, it's much more of a liability. And it's not considered the asset it was in an agricultural setting. So, we were told that the Asians were going to be totally different. And so they were going to outnumber us by vast numbers because they were just going to be different. And it turns out they're not different. They're not at all different. And the most plunging rates are in Asia right now. And the one thing I like to point out, I pointed out in the book, Taiwan's birth rate and China's birth rate both kind of took this nosedive across the 1970s. And then it was at the end of the 1970s that China put in the one-child policy. So not only did it happen before the one-child policy, largely, I mean, it was already set in motion, but Taiwan, which didn't have a one-child policy, which had every ambition or incentive to have lots of people, same collapse in terms of birth rate. So the economics of it and the cultural change of it and the fact that, you're not turning women into birthing machines as soon as they can procreate, that just narrows the window. And then you educate them, and then they have ambitions, and they want careers. And you get that mommy curve where they go out and they work, and then they have a couple of kids, and then they go back to work. That little valley there, most people can only have one or two kids. And you see families, crank out like 3 or 4 babies in 5 years, which is insane. But that's sort of what you have to do if you want to match that tempo. I don't think there's anything that stops it. And I think what's really depressing it right now is just people don't feel good about the future. I mean, I can remember being scared a lot in the 1960s based on all the scary projections people had. And Vietnam and, generational protests and race relations and women's lib and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot going on, and there was a lot of reasons to be depressed. But, I came from a family of 9 kids, so I end up with 6. I'd be amazed if I get 6 grandchildren. Absolutely amazed. I'd be amazed if I get 1. So there you go. I don't think there's much you can do about it. I think we're all going to live much longer, and it's going to stretch out existence, and that's going to be a real interesting thing to watch second half of this century. Okay. Thank you for coming, guys. I'm going to post this on Saturday. Sorry for the early trouble. Have a good night.